Welcome and good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Stanley. I'm the Associate Director and Curator of History here at the Museum of Sonoma County. And welcome to tonight's program, and thanks for joining us. A couple of quick Zoom housekeeping items before we get started here with the program. You're welcome to ask questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen at any time you like. We'll try to get to all of them, and we will allow some time at the end of the program to try to answer as many as possible. You can also enter questions into the chat, which is another button at the bottom of the screen. And though we are physically in different places tonight, we are coming together here for a program in conjunction with the museum's current exhibition, From Suffrage to Me Too, Groundbreaking Women in Sonoma County. While the museum's galleries are not currently open because of the pandemic, you can still experience the exhibit through a virtual exhibition and even a virtual tour that can be found on the museum's website. Tonight's program was made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and with the support of people like you joining us here tonight. If you feel like supporting programs like this one, as we continue to bring our community free online public programs during this challenging time, please consider becoming a member of the museum or renewing your membership or making a contribution to support the Museum of Sonoma County in our efforts. You can do that by texting the word program, P-R-O-G-R-A-M, to 91999 or go to museumsc/donate. So thank you so much for your support. So in 2020, this centennial year of the constitutional right of women to vote, our exhibition From Suffrage to Me Too doesn't just focus on the suffrage movement, but looks across the century from 1920 to 2020 and the changing expectations and challenges and obstacles to inclusion that women have faced over those decades. In each era, the exhibition highlights several groundbreaking or trailblazing women from Sonoma County. And so tonight's program fits right into that theme, perhaps with an added literary twist or two. So as part of our Museum Conversations program series, we have two incredible presenters for this evening to engage in a little back and forth. Jamahl Dunkle and Jonah Raskin will talk about two strong Sonoma County women, one of them real, the other fictional, and engage in an exploration of Charmian London, her marriage to Jack London, and their collaboration on some of Jack London's most famous books. Jonah Raskin is a professor emeritus at Sonoma State University, where he taught literature and law for 30 years. Jonah has published 16 books, including 3 murder mysteries set in Northern California, and he's the editor of the radical Jack London, Writings on War and Revolution, and the author of a booklet about London, Burning Down the House, as well as an advisor, contributor, and occasional program presenter here at the Museum of Sonoma County at different times over the years. And we've always been grateful for his input and participation. Jamahl Dunkle writes and lives in Northern California, and she was the 2017-18 Poet Laureate of Sonoma County and has received fellowships from Vermont Studio Center, the Lannan Foundation, Squaw Valley Community of Writers. Her newest collection of poems, West Fire Archive, is on the way in 2021 from the Center for Literary Publishing. Her previous poetry collections include Interrupted Geographies, Gold Passage, and There's a Ghost in This Machine of Air. Her works have been published in San Francisco Examiner, Los Angeles Review of Books, Chicago Quarterly Review, and many more. And of course, most pertinent to tonight, she has recently published the first full-length biography of Charmian London, called Charmian Kittredge London, Trailblazer, Author, Adventurer. Iris currently teaches at Napa Valley College. And it was Iris who recently reminded me that it was a photograph that she saw at the museum in 2015, a photograph of Charmian London taken in 1955 by the remarkable photographer Hansel Meath that helped inspire her to write her book. And it was Jonah that recently reminded me the other day that he presented a successful program here at the museum a number of years ago, delving into the fire that destroyed London's Wolf House before it was finished. And that he also helped inspire the museum to do that photography exhibition on Hansel Meath and Otto Hegel, writing an important article about them at the time. That was the same exhibition that Iris visited. So I cannot help but think that tonight's program brings us full circle, really around a conversation that started years ago. So with that, I am very pleased to turn the program over to Iris Dunkle and Jonah Raskin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so Iris, I believe we have a number of things in common.
Yes, we
A
do.
love of poetry, and we're both writers, and you're teaching, and I was a teacher for a long time. And then also we have maybe, I don't know what word to use, a fascination or obsession, perhaps, in a good sense, with Charmian and with Jack. You have honed in more on Charmian, and I have leaned over more towards Jack. So the first thing that I did want to ask you, or if you're willing to go there, is to, and I'm asking this because we've just come through this kind of bitter election, and we're celebrating the anniversary of women getting the right, fighting, finally succeeding after such a long time of battling for the right to vote. So what can you tell us, please, about voting and Charmian? I don't know anything at all about this subject. I know something about Jack and voting, but I don't know anything about Charmian.
Well, it's that's a good question, Jonah. It was interesting because I was originally going to be speaking about Charmian's connection to women getting the right to vote. I don't know if you remember, but if anyone in the audience has ever read John Barleycorn, Jack's memoir, quote unquote, about being an alcoholic. The first 2 pages is a conversation between him and Charmian about women getting the right to vote. And of course, at that time, he was against it because that would mean that he thought the women would vote down, would not support, would be for prohibition. And so he didn't think women should get the right to vote for that in the book. That's the way he put it. But so that brought up, as I was researching, I started to look into, how, when she voted and how she voted by looking at historical records. And she did indeed, the first time she voted as a socialist. And she did vote the first opportunity that she had, because as you know, California women got the right to vote before the national right to vote. So it's more than 100 years that women have been able to vote in California.
So yeah, in your book, your biography of Charmian, I believe you said that she was a socialist.
Yes.
I don't know what kind of socialist. There's all kinds of socialists.
Well,
for some people, it's a dirty word.
That's true. These days, it gets slung around like a negative thing. As you know very well, Jonah, socialism was very popular in that era, especially with people who were very more liberal-minded, as far as more wanting more programs for the very, very poor people in society. But what's really important about Charmian is she grew up in Berkeley at the turn of the century, or the late 1800s turn of the century. And Berkeley was a really, as it still is, but it was a very open-minded town. And she was raised on the ideas of Victoria Woodhouse. And so the idea of women having their own kind of agency to make decisions was a huge part of that, including about her sexuality. And so I think for her, the idea of socialism was an idea of choice and empowerment of all people rather than just select few.
Yeah. So as you know, Iris, Jack ran for mayor of Oakland twice, but I don't think he took it very seriously.
No.
He got very few votes. He ran as a more or less socialist, but I don't think he did very much campaigning because he had so many other things that he was doing. I mean, he was writing and traveling, and he did a lot of speaking about socialism and wrote a lot of kind of pamphlets. It was a
Yeah,
sort of fanning the flames of rebellion a lot of times in his life.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And they shared, I think they shared that belief.
I think one of the things that I like about your book is that I like books that bring to light people or figures who are there, but the general public is not aware of them. So it's kind of like resurrecting and somebody who's not exactly buried, but a kind of obscure.
Yeah.
So I think that's really an important thing that you do in your book. And
Thank you very much.
did you set out wanting to do that? You wanted to elevate this person who is not widely known?
Definitely. I mean, I started visiting the park when I was in 6th grade. I went on a field trip to Jack London State Historic Park. And up until that point, I knew I was a writer, but I didn't really know that there was a job called being a writer. And so when I went to the park, it was the first time I'd seen an actual writer in the flesh, well, not in the flesh, but in the exhibits and everything there. And I was like, oh, sign me up. That sounds like the best job ever. But when I went to the museum back in that time period, um, Charmian was not represented at all. She was barely represented in the museum. And something that's been corrected, thankfully, in the new revision of the exhibit in the House of Happy Walls. But on that day, I didn't realize I had met 2 authors, and so for me, once I realized, as I got older and I started to study Jack London, and I learned about the idea of that Charmian's biography may not be completely correct based on what Irving Stone represented her as. And just so you know, when I went to the park, on my field trip, I bought Irving Stone's book, Sailor on Horseback, and that was my first introduction to Charmian and Jack, is that biography, that fictional biography. And so it was really, I went full circle from, that was my first biography that I read, to completely beginning my biography by taking down Irving Stone's depiction of Charmian.
Yeah. Well, I know that Irving Stone did a lot of fictionalizing, but his book is also really important because for many people, it was the first book that they read about Jack London. So he created or helped to create a lot of the myths about the man.
I think
So
Jack and Charmian really created those myths themselves, and he unearthed them. Maybe that might be
yes,
a better way of putting it.
they were definitely myth makers about their own lives.
They really marketed themselves as a certain brand. And when I think that's why there's so many gaps. Like, I think, Jonah, you and I, have differing ideas about some of the facts about Jack's life, right?
Yes.
There's so many areas of questionable facts, right? And starting with his birth to the fire at Wolf House, right?
Yeah.
And I think the idea of why those holes are there is part of their elaborate marketing scheme, right? In order to sell books by the Jack London, the adventurer.
So I would say also that Jack was more than, what are the words to use? I mean, he knew pretty much what reality or the facts or truth was, and he decided not to go that way. I mean, he knew who his biological father was. He knew he was William Henry Cheney, but he chose not to say that.
Because it was a better story to have John London be his father. And I think that's part of, if you go back to like early articles that, Charmian wrote, that Sunset article in 1903 about Jack London when he was writing The Sea Wolf, called Jack London Afloat. And the article just really frames Jack as this writer of place, writer of adventure, and like starts kind of putting him in this like this brand, of who he was. Whereas like Jack London was actually not super strong and hardy, and the reality is he was pretty sickly his whole life. But that's not the image that he put forward.
right. He posed, flexing and pictures in his underwear
Yeah.
and talked about being very manly. Probably they had, I would say that Charmian was a very resilient person. She
Hmm.
was very good at bouncing back after miscarriages, and then she had this very long, creative, fulfilling life after Jack's death. I mean, he
Yeah.
died in 1916, and she lived until 1955.
Yeah. I think that's a really important part of her personality, because it wasn't just Jack that gave her trauma in her life. It was also the fact that her mother died, when she wasn't even 6 years old.
Yeah,
Um, and her father died when she was 14.
yes,
And she just was fiercely independent because of it and resilient. And I think she got that from her mother and father as well, who really, like, her mother was a pioneer, came across in an overland journey, and her father was also came across from Mount Desert Island during the gold rush. So they were and he was an entrepreneur, like going from like one job opportunity to another, like making a fresh start. Even up here in Petaluma with the American Hotel.
yeah. So Charmian has a 2-volume biography of Jack London. I like volume 2. I don't really care for volume 1 because there's too much avoidance of biographical facts. But I think volume 2 is a fantastic, from her point of view, portrait of a modern marriage, of
Definitely.
the difficulties of it, and as well as the fulfilling moments. I mean, it's so up close and in your face. I
I
I don't,
agree.
I don't think that it's got volume 2 has gotten the appreciation that it deserves.
I agree. I think a couple of factors led to um, her writing those two very disparate volumes. The first thing is she wrote about her husband's death just a few years after him dying, right? And anyone who writes biography knows that you need a little distance if you're going to be writing about something. Anyone who writes anything, right? Before you write about, someone that you cared about who passed away. But secondly, she was sworn, on the Dirigo, the ship that they took from from Baltimore around Cape Horn to Seattle. He had her swear that she would write his biography, and that it would contain these facts, the quote
Right,
unquote facts that she
right.
swore that she would keep alive. And so part of her legacy was to keep those myths alive. And I think, did she overdo those myths a little in volume 1? Certainly, certainly. She went way into like how John London was, a Saxon, and that's really over the top. But what you're saying about volume 2, Jonah, is when I another thing that led me towards writing this book was reading that volume. And for the first time in my life, and this is really only like 10 years ago, for the first time in my life, really like feeling what I felt like Jack London really was like. Like I felt like I got to know him in that volume. And
Yeah,
for the scene where he dies, it's just, I mean, I was bawling. It was it was so heart-wrenching. It was clear how much that affected her, how deeply it affected her. And it really helped me a great deal trying to recreate that scene within my book. So thank you, Charmian.
yes, yes. So uh, Jack had some close men friends. I mean, like Sterling.
Yes.
Um, but he was, if I stand back and look at his life, I mean, the guy was surrounded by women. I mean, he had his African American mother who raised him when he was real little. He had his biological mother. He had 2 wives, his first wife and his second wife. He had 2 daughters. I don't know, can I say that he had some girlfriends, you know?
Right. And beyond that, he also had Eliza, his sister, but also the person who really, besides Charmian, I think the closest person in his life.
Right, and she was like taking care of the ranch, Beauty Ranch.
Yeah, she and Charmian worked together to keep that ranch alive.
Yeah, I mean, because they were, Charmian and Jack were traveling a lot. They were in Hawaii a lot of the time.
Yeah, the time they actually spent on the ranch, as you know, was really limited.
Yeah,
They would go on these trips and they'd come back, and then they'd go on, on their little boat around the Bay Area, and then they'd come back, and then they go on their 4-horse road trip, or they were constantly traveling. They just were.
yeah.
That's how they functioned.
So, Iris, when I've made proposals to publishers about books, they always want to know, well, how is your book going to be different than any of the other books that are out there? Which I find is so very difficult to figure out, to sort of carve out a niche for myself. So there have been other scholars who've written about Charmian, as you know.
Yes.
Is it possible for you to say, like, what makes your book distinctive and
Definitely.
different than all the others?
Yeah, no, I am so grateful to the work that Clarice Stas did originally in American Dreamers, her first book about Jack and Charmian, and then in Jack London's Women. Both of those books are so well researched and really provided a great foundation for me to build from. And Clarice was such a mentor to me as I went on this journey writing this book, and helped me find some of the documents that were made available to her as well. But what happened since the time that she published Jack London's Women and the time when I started working on my book is more information became available. And because of that, it was possible to write a full-length biography about Charmian. And part of the reason why I think Clarice hadn't embarked on it, beyond the fact that it's really hard to write a biography, right? A full-length biography. She's smarter than me, basically. She didn't do it. But it's also because a lot of publishers aren't interested in telling the story of a woman, especially a woman whose name, like you said, had been kind of taken out of the limelight, even though Charmian during her lifetime was giving talks to 23,000 people in Europe. Nowadays, like until quite recently, when the museum was remodeled and the work of, a lot of people have been bringing back Charmian in her life, she wasn't known at all, and people didn't even realize that she'd written 4 books and lots of articles, and that she helped. The fact that she helped write some of Jack's books was really kind of the thing that really drew the attention of publishers and making them want to tell the story. And thankfully,
yeah. So, yes, I would say that Charmian could have survived without Jack, but Jack couldn't really survive without Charmian. She was his muse. She was his secretary. She did all this typing. She was
more than a secretary, Jonah.
Well, I mean, just she typed.
Yeah.
She edited the book. She served as a character that he put in the books.
Yes.
He borrowed from her family and her history. I mean, certainly in Valley of the Moon.
Yeah.
I mean, she was like all women for him in some ways. So, I mean, I know, I don't know how, when she read these books, she must have been aware that she must have recognized herself in some ways. And did that trouble her, do you know?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I want to say quickly that like the parts where her family shows up, that's actually her writing in the Valley of the Moon, is all of the discussions about that book and the development of it they had those discussions together on the Dirigo and previously on their trip on the 4-horse trip up and down California and Oregon.
But her name is not, she doesn't share the, Jack and Charmian.
No, because why do you think? Why do you think so, Jonah? You think people would buy a book by Charmian Kittredge London when they could buy one by Jack London during that time period?
Well, he definitely branded himself.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Best-selling author. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think she was, but to answer your question more directly is, so for example, one of the women that the characters that Jack based on partially on Charmian, was Little Women in the Big House, right?
Yeah.
The main character, the protagonist in that story. And at the end of it, she commits suicide, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sorry to ruin it for you all, but when she read that, she recorded in her diary that it was horrible, and they had just, they had gone through this like difficult time of losing a child, and then her going through like surgery to try to repair what happened because of that, and she had been flirting with this pianist from Australia, and Jack was pissed, and he wrote her character in that way that was really it really got to her, and so it led them to really discuss why he did that, because she saw it before. Obviously she typed it up from his notes, and so that was a big moment for them.
Yeah,
for sure.
so I did want to say a couple things about my connection to Jack.
Well, I was going to ask you that question.
Oh, well,
I want to know what made you become a Jack London scholar. Like, why did you go down this path?
Well, the first Jack London book that I read was The Iron Heel, which is a dystopian novel. It's about a coming of an oligarchy, authoritarian rule to the United States. So I read it when I was a teenager. I found it very gripping. I had no idea that he wrote stories that involve dogs. I mean, it wasn't until the 100th anniversary of Call of the Wild that I read it. And
wow.
I would say that I was blown away by it. I mean, it's a literary tour de force.
Mm-hmm.
So I had read Jack London, and then my parents moved to Sonoma County in 1970, and I came to visit them, and I said to my father, "Why did you come here?" And he said, "Well, if it was good enough for Jack London, then it's good enough for me and your mother."
Really?
Yes,
I didn't know that.
That's what he said. So I'm not sure what it was. I think it probably was rereading or reading for the first time The Call of the Wild, and then reading the 3 volumes of Jack's letters.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his letters are fantastic. I mean, they say so much about him.
Mm-hmm.
And those letters really set a fire under me. So I went to see Milo Shepherd,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought that I was going to have to get permission from Milo to use the material at the Huntington, all the letter archives, manuscripts. And Milo said, "No, it's just, you can just go down there and use it. You don't have to get my permission."
Really?
That's what he said. So, and that was true.
Wow.
I mean, did you get anybody's permission? Did you ask for
Yeah.
somebody's
I
permission?
had to get permission.
From who?
Well, I had to apply for permission. Well, first, just you have to be a scholar, right? You have to be a professor somewhere at an institution. And then Schaefer gave me a letter of introduction, and so did Earl Labor.
Okay.
But I probably would have been able to go just as a scholar.
Right. Well, I just went down to the Huntington, and they gave me permission to come in because, like, I was
awesome.
A scholar. Yes.
Maybe they cracked down later to keep,
yeah, maybe a lot of
keep people like me out.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to cause trouble. So and then Jack's work lost copyright. It all fell into the public domain. So I'm not really sure why that happened. I mean, Charmian was trying to keep up the myth of Jack London, but she allowed all these books to go out. She didn't control the copyright.
Well, she died. That's what happened, and no one else was following that up. So part of what she didn't leave behind was a legacy to keep that up. So that was part of the fact was she had dementia towards the end of her life, and many of her the last bit of her life, many of those last wishes were not kept.
Well, if I had been around then, I would have urged her to maintain the copyright. Yes.
I wish she would have been around. Everyone would be a lot more wealthy in that family.
Yes. Right.
I
So,
have a question for you though about your mystery book, which I really enjoyed reading,
okay,
which is set in Sonoma.
yes.
Um, First, I wanted to ask who you based your main character, your protagonist, on, and then why a mystery? Why? Because I know you've written several mysteries, but what draws you to this form?
Well, the main character, the detective, private investigator, Tioga Vignetta, she is a completely fictional character. I mean, I don't know anybody like her. I don't know any private investigators in Sonoma County. I don't know anybody who's as diligent and as nutty as she is. She's rather nutty.
She
She like
is.
pushes it. She goes to the edge and she goes over the edge, I would say, a lot of times. So I have always been fascinated by mysteries and murder mysteries and detective stories. It began when I was a kid, and there used to be movies back east on CBS TV on the Late Late Show. And they used to show these old black and white detective pictures. So I would stay up till 1 or 2 in the morning to watch them. And then I taught at Sonoma State a class that was called The Mysteries of College Composition. So, yes. So the students had to read mysteries, murder mysteries, and then they had to write their own murder mysteries.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, and I mean, they were great. There was a Chinese student who used the ideas and insights of Confucius to like solve the crimes.
That's awesome.
Yes, and then there was a student who had the character who was this arsonist, and his descriptions of arson were so vivid that all the other students thought this guy must be setting fires all over the place. You know? So uh, I went to Mexico in 1975 to do a biography of a obscure writer by the name of B. Traven, Traven. He wrote The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which was made into
Yes.
a movie.
Yeah,
So
actually.
he didn't want anybody to write his biography. He was very mysterious. He destroyed a lot of his papers. So I realized after a while that I couldn't write a biography of this person, but I could write a book about a man trying to write a book about a man who doesn't want his biography to be written. So,
Right.
I took readers into the whole experience of being in Mexico, and I lived in his house. And after a while, I started to use his typewriter and wear his clothes and take on his persona. So I thought about doing that with Jack London, but I said, no, that's too hokey. You can't do that. Spend a night in the House of Happy Walls. No, forget about it. Do it once with one writer, but not again and again. Um, so I've always admired novelists. Um, and I've written a lot of criticism, cultural and criticism. So, but after a while, I feel like, well, if you're really a good writer, you should be able to create um, as well as criticize. So that's what led me to write these books with Tioga. And the third one, well, I wanted to write a trilogy. So I had to pick up with her and conclude this book with her. She might come back at another time. I don't have any plans for her to come back. I've embarked on some other novels and she's not in them. But
Okay.
I think there's always going to be some mysterious things that are going on in my book that the reader doesn't know really what's happening. And in the course of the narrative, the reader finds out, oh, this person is connected to that person, and this
Yeah.
is what's really going on. I mean, that's all what great literature is a lot about, isn't it? What do
Oh,
you
yeah.
think?
I agree. I think those underlying secrets and connections are so important. I feel like you've just given us such a good intro that you should maybe read a little section of your book if you'd be open to that.
Sure. Okay.
And then maybe afterwards I'll read a little section of mine.
Okay. I hope so. So this is from a chapter called The Heart of the Valley. So I would say in the first two books, I called it Sonoma Valley. And then I decided to try to make it more universal, like could be any valley in California. And I didn't, this is the second chapter, but I wrote the second chapter near the end of the manuscript because I kind of wanted to have a sort of overview for the reader. The valley hid its dark past and tried to ignore its dark future. Some folks, fools that they were, glimpsed darkness from around a corner and cried out, "Bring it on." The valley rose out of the waters of the bay and galloped north and west until it reached the outskirts of the county seat. There were banks, hospitals, courts, and jails. The wealthy binged in big houses on tree-lined avenues. The poor survived in tents and under bridges on the outskirts, where they died alone of pneumonia, cancer, and diseases that didn't yet have a name or a cure. For some, it was the valley of lost years. For others, it was the valley of vice, where you could pay for anything and everything you wanted. Sex or speed, art or religion, friends or enemies, if that was your thing. The woman whose life and times you will read about here saw it all, or at least a great deal of it. She recorded nearly everything she saw and heard. It helped her maintain her sanity. Keeping records was a part of her job. So one of the challenges in writing murder mystery set around here is that a lot of people told me that's impossible. There's no crime in Sonoma. You know, I mean, and I would say, I'd give them articles from the Sonoma Index Tribune or the Press Democrat. Look, this guy embezzled money, or this was, you know, somebody was sexually harassing these students, or, but people didn't want to believe that there was crime here. So there are certain, I think it's difficult to write a murder mystery in this place.
Mm-hmm.
If you set it in LA or San Francisco or New York, I think it's easier for people to accept it. So I was aware that I was sort of challenging certain preconceived notions, and I couldn't, you know, there's certain things that I couldn't really have. I mean, I didn't think that I could get away with having like a serial killer in this valley, you know, whereas if it's in San Francisco or LA, you could have a serial killer, or London. I mean, a lot of murder mysteries have serial killers. So, though, I mean, in the latest one, I did borrow from, there was a man over in Sonoma Valley who killed this man and chopped up his body in pieces and put it in an oil drum and then dumped it in front of City Hall.
Wow.
I mean, that's a real crime in Sonoma Valley. So
Yeah.
I did put that in the book. Yes. So, and I do have a kind of Jack London subplot. I have a man who grows grapes and makes wine, and he's also a Jack London collector. And he tells the detective that somebody is stealing his manuscripts, the Jack London material. So so Jack goes to his estate and goes into this place where all this stuff is and looks around and through all these manuscripts and decides that it's not true. Nobody is stealing these things, and he thinks the guy is just trying to set up his wife for a divorce, accuse her, you know, of marauding his files. So, I mean, Jack London is definitely a part of the scene here. So I wanted to include him in along with everything else.
That makes sense. I love how you added him into the story that way.
Would you please read something from your biography of Charmian?
Sure. I thought I'd read a little bit from chapter 9, which is called The Curse of the Albatross, as a reference to the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And this is about the time that Jack and Charmian were on the Dirigo, the ship that went from Baltimore around Cape Horn to Seattle. And right before they got on the ship, Jack had been on this long bender in New York City. And Charmian was so mad at him that first he shaved his head as a new start to the before he went on the ship. He was like, I'm going to shave my head. And she's like, well, then I'm going to cut off all my hair. And at the time, like as a woman, to have a shaved head would be quite crazy. But she did cut off 6 inches of her hair before they got on the ship. And she also got a little dog as a way to get back at him. So she bought a little dog and brought it on the ship. So this is from The Curse of the Albatross. The air was crisp and the snow crunched underfoot as they stood beside Edgar Allan Poe's tomb at Westminster Hall and Burying Ground in Baltimore, Maryland on April 30th, 1912. The Greater Baltimore Committee took the celebrity couple for a tour of the city, ending with a photo op at the famous writer's grave. Publicly, Charmian tried to exude her cheerful self, but inside she was exhausted and thoroughly frustrated with Jack's behavior. That morning, after they'd signed on as crew on the Dirigo, the immense 4-masted ship chosen for their journey around Cape Horn, Jack shaved his head clean, quote, as a billiard ball, and announced his new look was symbolic of his new beginning. He planned to give up alcohol once they boarded the ship. Charmian loved Jack's curls. She was horrified by her now bald husband and threatened to shave her own head in retaliation. Instead, she cut 8 inches off her long hair, no small rebellion at a time when a long pin-backed hair was a symbol of female beauty. She also vowed not to look at him until his hair had grown back at least half an inch. At the gravesite, Jack pulled his cap down low over his bald head, while Charmian hid her swollen eyes and her red fox furs. On March 2nd, 1912, Jack, Charmian, Nakata, and Possum, the small dog Charmian impulsively bought the day before they left, all boarded the Dirigo at Baltimore Harbor. The Londons had difficulty securing passage because the cargo ship had no license to carry passengers. However, with an agreement to pay $1,000 for their passage, they signed on, Jack as third mate, Charmian as stewardess, and Nakata as cabin boy. Neither Jack nor Charmian would be expected to work as part of the crew, but Nakata's services were to be made available to the entire crew, even though he was expected to give back his earnings at the end of the trip. Most of the crew, thanks to the transition in the maritime business from wind to steam-powered vessels, had never sailed before and knew none of the sea chanties that were traditionally sung when a sailing vessel had left harbor. But Jack and Charmian, who had read up on maritime traditions, insisted that they sing. And so, under a full moon, they left land behind, with everyone standing on deck, bundled against the icy air, listening to the stuttering, uncertain voices of the crew while the Dirigo was tugged toward the mouth of the sea. And I just wanted to end with a little tiny scene from towards the end of the book, which is the scene that includes Hansel Meath and Otto Hagel when they visited Charmian at the ranch. This is after Jack's death. And it was actually, I just want to make a little correction that because actually what fascinated me about the photo that I saw at the museum's exhibit was that it was dated 1955, and Charmian actually died in January 1955, and she looks quite lively in that picture. And I was like, how could they have gotten that picture in 1955? And so I did some research, and it actually was taken in 1943. And so this is the when that photograph was taken. Several years later, on a cool fall day in 1943, nearly 7 years after she'd begun the project, the young photographers Hansel Meath and Otto Hagel visited her at the House of Happy Walls. This was just 5 years before Meath would become the second woman photographer to join the staff of Time magazine. Her husband, Hagel, worked as a freelancer for Life magazine and as President Franklin Roosevelt's official photographer. They'd recently purchased a ranch nearby and arranged to visit and photograph Charmian because they had long admired their work. Their documentary style photography was reminiscent of Jack and Charmian's photographic attempts to capture human dignity, especially in the people who had been cast off or forgotten by society. When they arrived, Charmian took the couple on her sacred walk to the hillside where Jack was buried and the nearby ruins of Wolf House. Photos from that day show Charmian posed in the ruins of Wolf House, dressed in her rugged riding clothes, a wide smile spread across her face. She looks content, as if she is smiling into the beautiful ruins of her life.
Great. Also, love the story about the, the hair. That's great.
Isn't that
Right
funny?
into their marriage and
Yeah,
dynamic.
there was a lot of fire there.
So yeah, when I was doing research about the Wolf House fire, I talked to the fire chief in Glen Ellen, who grew up there, and some other people who grew up in Glen Ellen, and people used to say that they went to Charmian. This was like in the 40s, and said, can we ride horseback over the ranch? Can we play in the ruins of Wolf House? And so, kids in the neighborhood, we're all over the place, exploring and playing games and horseback riding. And it was only later on that you couldn't get into the ruins of Wolf House.
It's so true. Like, I think everyone who grew up in Glen Ellen has a story of like playing around in that from that era in the ruins.
Yeah.
Well, do you think we should open up to the audience to see if they have any questions?
Absolutely, definitely. Eric or John or?
Here, I'm back.
Hi, Eric.
Hey, we have a couple of questions in the chat, but real quick, I thought maybe it'd be great for the audience to share. I've got those photographs queued up, and that's great to learn that those were actually taken in the 40s. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So I wondered, Iris, maybe it'd be a good thing to ask you, maybe would you be willing to talk to these photographs a little bit?
Oh, I'd love
If I
to.
share them and say, what struck you about them, and maybe, or either of you, what strikes you about these photos, and what, maybe what changed after you did all your research and did, so here, I'm gonna share my screen.
Oh yeah. Well, that was the one I was talking about right there. So this is a picture of Charmian smiling she's standing in the ruins at Wolf House. And for me, this was such an embodiment of like her resilience as a person. So they had, this is the walk I was just talking about, and this is a photograph that I was speaking about in that last passage that I read. So this is 1943, and it was the first photograph that they took when they came to visit, or one of the first one of her. And there's a series of these. There's some where she's not smiling. This is my favorite.
So I also did want to, go ahead. There she is at work. Messy desk.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, this is her actually working on the log of the Dirigo. So that passage that I just read when they were going on that trip, she kept a diary throughout that journey in 1912 and lost that journal, and then refound it when she moved into the house at Happy Walls and started working on this project. And you can see, if you could see my office, you'd see I have a lot in common with Charmian, but that idea of how she thought visually, if you look at the papers on her desk, that's actually the diary of the Dirigo, and she used pins to like put pieces of paper together, like we use sticky notes, so she'd pin her papers together. And unfortunately, when they took all of those files at the Huntington, they undid all of those pins. But this picture actually helped us determine where her desk was in the House of Happy Walls, and helped me make a case for the fact that Charmian actually had a desk in the House of Happy Walls, and it wasn't just her guest quarters. It was actually her office that she had upstairs.
All right, well, anything else you want us to say about those? You can stop here, I'll stop.
I just also wanted to say that Jack London was an outstanding photographer.
Oh yeah.
He was a documentary photographer. He went to London near about 1900 and took pictures of people in the slums and pictures of people in Korea when he was going over to cover the Russian-Japanese War. I mean, he was an excellent photographer. I believe Iris, he took that famous photograph of Charmian who wearing a pistol on her hip in the
He
South
did.
East.
Yeah, he took that one for sure. And the
Very
one of her in the
dramatic.
marketplace. Yeah. Um, they both took really amazing photographs of one another. So she took some of the most classic photos that you see of Jack London were taken by Charmian, even though she didn't get credit. So I think they shared that love of photography. In fact, she learned her love of photography, Charmian did, from Grace Hudson's family up in Ukiah. Grace Hudson's father was a famous photographer, and he took photographs of Charmian for a article in the Overland Monthly, and that Grace Hudson was going to be illustrating. And that's actually how she met her good friend, Huddy, as she called her.
Oh, and Iris, I think that answers one of our first question that was typed into the chat, was
Oh, really?
as to whether you saw the letters at the Grace Hudson Museum and were aware of that.
Yes, I did. In fact, it was one of the first stops that I made because it's local. It was easy to go to the archives. They were so kind there, and got to see all of her letters and Charmian's letters to Grace Hudson. They were friends until Grace Hudson's death, and Charmian always kept this little conch, this like artist conch that Grace Hudson made for her. That it's a picture of a small Native American child's face on this conch, which is actually like a type of mushroom that artists paint on, and it's part of her. It's part of her personal collection she kept on her desk.
So some years ago, a man contacted me who had some letters from Charmian to one of his relatives. And while he was going, I think I made copies and sent them to you.
Yeah,
And he was going through his, like, it was either like a father or grandfather. He found these letters from Charmian. I know that there's lots of Jack London letters that are in private hands that very few, if any, scholars or historians have seen. And that to me is troubling.
yes.
I would like them to be in the Huntington or some other library. I don't know how to pry them loose from people who have them.
You can't, you just have to beg them to let you read them, which is what I ended up having to do.
Yeah, well, it's good you got to read them.
Not all of them, but ones I could find, right?
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. Go ahead.
Another question we have here, this is, I guess, kind of a researcher about scholars of London. We have a question here about, there was a London scholar who came to Sonoma State for a year, but was only there for a year from University of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Do you know who that is?
Yes.
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 Susan Nurnberg.
Yeah. So I believe Susan is transcribing Charmian's diary now, or probably part of it.
She's transcribing the diaries from the time when Jack was alive.
Yeah, like around 1905 or 1906 to 1960.
Yeah, from their marriage to the time of his death. Yeah, and that's going to be coming out from University of Nebraska Press, but I don't know when.
Well, that'll probably be the next big thing in terms of learning about Charmian and Jack.
Definitely.
Diaries. So, you did use the word sex, Iris, so Charmian did record in her diary when she and Jack had sex.
Yes, they did.
And it seems like it was sort of in code.
Well, she called it, they called it a lolly. And so, but it was pretty, she had different codes for different things. Yes. And it's very well documented. Yes. It made me never want to keep a diary in my life.
Right. Exactly. Lolly, lolly, lolly.
Another question here for Iris. In what way do you most identify with Charmian? Or could be both of you, actually. Why not?
Yeah, Jonah. I think for me, I identified with uh, her resilience and her going against kind of the gender norms of the time, you know, and just living the life that she wanted to live, even though she had a lot of things that went against her. So my friends, though, like to make note of the fact that I have 3 dogs, and I'm like her because I just randomly get dogs before I go on a long journey.
Well, so Iris, you are a mother. You have children.
Yes.
Charmian wanted to have children, and that never was a reality. And I think you understand or understood the loss that she felt when she didn't, you know, she didn't get to be a mother. I think you have to be a woman writer to appreciate that.
Yeah, I think for me, when I finally read about she lost Joy Baby, her daughter, at 38 hours after her birth, after a terrible birth, and Charmian almost died on the table, and so I gave a whole chapter to that part of their life because it was such an important part for her that she really wanted to be a mother and couldn't become a mother because of what happened that day and because of what happened afterwards. That's something that was never really a big part of other biographies about Jack and Charmian. So you're right, Jonah, that was really important to me to add in.
Yep. Thanks for doing that.
Thank you for bringing it up.
Here we have a question, and maybe, I mean, this is a fairly simple question, but maybe it begs to sketch in very briefly about the homes and when they moved in and what happened, because the straightforward part of the question is, where was the House of Happy Walls? So maybe you guys could quickly distinguish Wolf House and House of Happy Walls and kind of the timeline of that, maybe.
Well, all these places are at what's now, you know, Jack London State Historic Park. The House of Happy Walls is there. It's the museum. The cottage where they lived in is there. I mean, most of their life they lived in Sonoma County. I mean, Jack had lived in Oakland for a good part of his life. I don't think he ever really lived with Charmian in Oakland. I mean, they met kind of secretly for a while in Sonoma County.
Yeah, but he had a house in Oakland where they would stay too.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But yeah. And the Jack London State Historic Park, as you know, Jonah, is in Glen Ellen, and it's a great place to visit. And they've newly remodeled the House of Happy Walls, which is the house that Charmian built for herself after Jack died. She didn't move in until well into the 30s, but she started building it in the 20s. And she built it so that it would never burn because it was a place, she had experienced so many fires in her life, including, as Jonah has written about, the Wolf House, which was the mansion that she and Jack designed and built, which was about, I think it's about 3/4 of a mile from the House of Happy Walls. And that is about a 1/4 mile from the cottage, which is where they actually lived on the ranch. And the cottage is also open as a museum that you can visit and tour. But that's where they actually lived when they were together, when they were actually there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And here's one. I'm not sure how to interpret this question exactly, but it's what was the discrepancy between Iris's and Charmian's story and Jonah's mention of the Wolf House and the fires? I don't know if that's asking if there's differences between your interpretation of the fires.
I think that Iris says in her book that there are some people who, and I think maybe she's referring to me, there's some people who think that it was arson. So Jack and Charmian thought that it was in 1913, they thought it was arson.
Yeah, they did.
And they suspected people.
Mm-hmm.
And then years and years later, a group of forensic experts came up and said, oh no, it was spontaneous combustion. There were some rags that caught fire and burned down the Wolf House. So I mean, so I guess I was playing detective and poking around, and I read someplace that Jack said if I didn't think I would be happy in the house, I would burn it down myself. And he says that in The House Beautiful. I think it's in the volume called Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who did the forensic report didn't really know the logistics of the ranch. In the back when there was the fire, you didn't get to you didn't get up there on London Ranch Road. You got up on Hill Street. So, and then one of my friends said, well, James Shepard, Eliza's husband, was a very likely suspect in arson because he and Jack had had a big fight soon before the fire, and Jack kicked him off the ranch so that he could have been a suspect.
Yeah, it's definitely a mystery.
Yeah.
I can see why you're attracted to it, Jonah.
So, and then also, I mean, Gay LeBaron said to me, oh, yeah, there was this young man her father was working at Wolf House, and the kid was in Wolf House and heard Charmian say, "You'll never live in this house, Jack." And, took that as a kind of threat. So, and I talked to the guy, and he said, absolutely, it's stood up for the story. So, some spontaneous combustion story doesn't really make sense to me. There were some rags there. I mean, even I talked to Darius Anderson, who's a big Jack London fan and collector, and he said, well, I mean, all of the workmen there were highly skilled. He said they wouldn't just leave rags lying around. They know about the danger of rags. So, I mean, a lot of different people kind of like poked holes in the story. And then even the guy who led the investigative team, when I said to him, well, Jack himself said, I would burn it down if I didn't think I'd be happy there. He said, well, if I was the DA, I'd put him on the witness stand and cross-examine him, So he did. Jack insured the house. He collected on the insurance.
But not that much. That's the thing. I mean, that's where I would.
But he also never paid the premium.
Yeah. Well, that left them pretty broke after that. Because they were pretty destitute.
He he allowed the insurance company to use his name in their advertisement. So instead of paying.
I think these are the kind of intriguing parts of the London story that suck me and Jonah in for years of scholarship, right? There's all of these little things that are questionable and are mysteries, right? That we have to go in and debate for the rest of our lives. I think it's awesome. I love that we have ideas on this.
So I think that Jack was in a lot of pain at the end of his life.
Yes, he was.
Very much, there's one part in her biography where Charmian lists all of his illnesses. The guy had a lot of illnesses.
Yeah.
And so he was taking the painkillers because he was in a lot of pain.
Yeah, he was shooting morphine.
Yep. So, I mean, how coherent was he? How clear-minded was he at the end there?
That's a good question.
Well, here we have another
40 years old.
Here we have another question to either speaker. Did Charmian and Jack have an open marriage, would you say? Did they have other partners? And the follow-up to that is, was Charmian also a big drinker like Jack was, or was she a...
Well, I'll start with the drinking question, and I'll leave you to the open marriage, Jonah. Just kidding. the drinking issue, Charmian did like to drink. She records in the like for fun. Like she records in her diary when she drank champagne when they got to the Marquesian Islands, and their night of partying that night. And I mean, there's plenty of times when she did drink, and she didn't smoke cigarettes ever. She was disgusted by that habit. And Jack did smoke 4 packs of Lucky Strike unfiltered a day. But she didn't drink like Jack. No, she didn't go on multi-day binges. And as time went on, she got more and more irritated with that, for sure.
Yeah, there's one story that Charmian tells where Jack would get into bed and he'd be smoking a cigarette in bed, and the cigarette would roll out of his mouth and start to burn a hole in the pillowcase, and she'd come in and put it out.
Yep.
Yep. So in terms of, I would say Jack had an open marriage and Charmian didn't while they were married. Yes. I mean, maybe Jack was a kind of philanderer. He was kind of sneaky at times.
I think she was pretty aware of what was going on.
Okay.
I think they had an agreement about that. And Charmian grew up in a house that had an open marriage. So Ninetta Ames, her aunt who raised her from the time she was 6, or almost 6, and Roscoe Ames had an open marriage, kind of based on those Berkeley ideals that I was talking about earlier in the program. And so I think her idea is like, that's why she didn't find it at odds to have an affair with a married man. It was something that was normalized within her family culture.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how aware she was of what was going on. I mean, some of their closest friends didn't really know what was going on.
She was aware in her diary. She made note of several of the interactions. She didn't know about everything, and she did realize it afterwards. Like in New York, she had some realizations about after his death. When she traveled there in 1918, the famous time when she had an affair with Harry Houdini. She did find out about some of Jack's affairs in New York, but she wasn't like the thing was it didn't really mar her image of him, which was surprising to me.
So when I wanted to reflect on something that Clarice made me aware of when I started doing my work on Jack London. She said that biographers often did what Freud called like transference and countertransference. That the biographer would project onto the subject some things from his or her life, and also take things from the subject's life and incorporate them in his or her life. So I think, I don't know if that's can be avoided. It's just something to be aware of if you're writing biography. You get really tangled up in the subject, the people you're writing about.
That's certainly true. And I think that's why I'm always drawn to these strong women that are feisty and go against the rules of society, because I kind of see kindred spirits there.
So Iris, you have a book of poems that's coming out soon. I believe they go back to Charmian.
Actually, yeah, it's called Westfire Archive, and it comes out in February this year. Some of the poems actually were written while I was poet laureate, and they're about the 2017 fires that we all experienced in Sonoma County. I also lost my mother at that time, and so those stories are kind of tangled together. But the first section of it, which is called which is a section on biography. It's like set up like archival boxes, not for real, but in a book form. And the first section is the poetry I wrote while I was doing this research on Charmian. And so as a poet, I had to really process it through poetry before I could actually write prose. Probably for that very reason, Jonah, that you were just talking about, that kind of attachment you feel to a character or to a historical figure. That really, like I had to write all of these poems about her Dirigo diaries before I could actually write the chapter on the Dirigo. Yeah,
that makes perfect sense. So I've written, I write poetry and fiction and nonfiction, and I think all of it comes out of my brain. or my heart. I don't subscribe to the right brain, left brain kind of thing. Yeah,
Me
although
neither.
some people swear by it.
No, I think when you're a writer, you're a writer.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, what I'm taking from all of this is that we have a lot of reading to do. So I think we've kind of come to the end of questions. Do you guys have any last minute?
Well, I would just say you should check out Jonah's mystery. I think there's a link in the chat to where you can pick it up, and I think there's a link in there too. You can pick up my book at any of the local bookstores, at Copperfield's or Reader's Books, or if you're in Napa at Book Mine, or you can obviously buy it online. But if you want a signed copy, there's instructions on how to reach out to me to get a copy, and I'll send it to you in the mail, since we can't do this in person. I'd love to sign one and personalize it for you.
So there's a new movie based on Jack London's novel Martin Eden. It's Italian. It's in Italian with English subtitles. They changed the setting from the San Francisco Bay Area to Naples. Doesn't really work for me, because the book is so much a part of, our world. Jack was Oakland, San Francisco, Glen Ellen, San Francisco Bay. That's so much his world, shaped by it. Yeah. So to move it to Naples, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I just wrote a piece about that, actually, that's going to be coming out in Electric Lit in the next couple, I don't know, weeks.
I'll look forward to it.
Excellent.
Well, wonderful. Thank you both for doing this and being part of the program and putting this on. We appreciate it so much. And thanks to everyone for attending tonight. And I wish everybody a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us, Eric and John.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonah, for the great questions.
All right, carry on.